Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Trust's webinar, Get Ready for a Year of Action to Change the Game for Heritage. My name is Natalie Bull. I'm just going to take a minute to walk you through some of the technical features of the webinar. On the top left side of your screen, you can access both the chat and the Q&A features. You can use the chat feature to share comments and ideas with the group, and also to let us know if you're having technical difficulties. Our technician is standing by and she'll be able to field those questions. And you can use the Q&A feature to post questions for the open forum at the end of the webinar today. And please just note that we'll be sending you the slides and a recording of today's webinar, so you don't have to furiously take notes and copy them on the slides as you go. The National Trust for Canada is a national charity that leads and inspires action for places that matter. And this webinar today is really, I think, an interesting example of some of the action that we are leading for the heritage movement in Canada. You can learn more at our URL there on the screen, and I encourage you to join us. As I said, my name is Natalie Bull. I'm Executive Director here at the National Trust, and I'm pleased to be here presenting with two other colleagues from the Trust, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
Oh, hi, I'm Chris Weave. I'm the Manager of Heritage Policy and Public Programs at the Trust, and it's a hugely exciting moment, I think, in Canada because there hasn't been this kind of attention and appetite for historic conservation tax credits, and really looking forward to building momentum with you today.
I'm Katrina Garrett, Manager of Communications for the National Trust, and I'm here today because communications will play an integral role in this initiative. We've outlined a plan and strategy, but we need your help and support.
And two special guests that we have with us today, Gil Barrows, who's a principal at Vox Public Affairs. Gil?
Thanks, Natalie. I've been doing government relations and public affairs for close to 30 years, and I've seen a lot of campaigns come and go. I gotta say that this one is lining up right, simply because the Liberals are on side in principle. They've said they support at least talking about financial incentives. The Conservatives have demonstrated that they're in support with their private members bill, and the NDP, we know we're gonna come on side. So we've got everything lined up, and I think what we need to concentrate now is pushing it across the goal line, getting the final resolution.
Great, thank you, Gil. And another special guest, Tom Cassidy from south of the border. Tom Cassidy is Vice President of Government Relations and Policy. You may have heard him speak at our conference just this past fall in Ottawa. Tom, welcome, and you'll have an opportunity to share your success story with the U.S. tax credit, but would you like to just say hello to our participants today?
Chris, for the opportunity to be with you again.
Great. Thanks, Tom. We'll just look at the agenda for today. So first we'll start with a brief summary of the opportunity that we have, then the goals of the campaign of the Year of Action, and then the third item, we'll hand it over to Tom Cassidy to hear some inspiration and advice from his experience with the U.S. National Trust and the U.S. tax credit. Then we will review the plan for 2018. We'll walk you through the toolkit that we launched just last week. And then we'll have an open forum with the chance for you to ask questions and share your perspectives. So first, let's say a few words about the opportunity. As Chris mentioned in his opening remarks, this is really an exciting moment, I think, in the history of heritage in Canada. I personally have waited my whole career to hear federal elected employees talk about historic places on Parliament Hill. So I think the stars are aligning, and we've got a great opportunity to make a difference, to gain some real movement in federal action, something that we really have been waiting for decades. Gil, do you want to say a couple of words? I guess you did talk a bit about the opportunity.
Yeah, I will just say, I think the most important thing right now that the National Trust has done a good job in Ottawa. And now we've got to do, I guess, what Tom Cassidy has done in the U.S. We've got to demonstrate support, and Tom's going to run us through what they did. And if we can do a tenth of that, we've got a very, very good chance of success.
So Chris Weave jumping in here, just wanted to talk to this timeline. And just to back up even a little bit further than 2015, in the early 2000s, there was a program called the Commercial Heritage Properties Incentive Fund that was actually piloted under a Liberal initiative, the Historic Places Initiative. And it was actually kicking the tires and testing the possibilities and the appetite for a tax credit in Canada. And it actually had a very, very profound and strong economic impact. And those lessons are there to be learned from, and we include them in some of our materials. So it's interesting then that the Liberals now in their most recent election response to us around whether there be appetite on their part for tax incentives said that they were open to measures to use the tax system. So that was a Liberal statement in the 2015 election. And it's interesting then that it was a private member's bill, Bill C-323, in December of 2016 that brought back the focus on tax incentives and really catalyzed a discussion in the House of Commons around whether there was incentives needed at the federal level for historic places. And that actually turned into a broader discussion about what is the federal role in heritage. And so that led to the 2017 study and report by the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. And they came out with a report just now in December 2017, fulsome report looking at a number of different elements that are needed. And so, I mean, some of you may have read this report. It's not super long, so I recommend going in there. It had 17 recommendations. A lot of them were about getting the government house in order and retrofitting or renovating some of their policies in terms of what they recognize as heritage. The ones that we found particularly interesting, germane for our constituency, were around funding of different kinds of heritage. And so there was a recommendation around establishing a tax credit for commercial and income-producing buildings. There was a recommendation around regular funding for the National Cost Sharing Program for heritage places, which is for National Historic Sites only, which is a small constituency, but an important one of about 750 places. And there were other recommendations around supporting Indigenous-led initiatives to protect, identify, and preserve their places, which were also important. There were some other ones around main streets and other kind of programs that would help support historic places, but it's a fulsome report, and I encourage you to have look at that a little further. So even in advance of the report, we had, in consultation with others in the heritage sector, we had come to an understanding around what were the main goals. Not around getting the federal house in order, which is obviously important, but it was more about these two goals around measures that would encourage private sector investment in historic places, and also federal measures that would help fund efforts of Indigenous groups and charities and not-for-profits that wouldn't benefit from some of the types of measures that are there for commercial and income-producing properties. So why is federal action necessary? Well, I think here's a number of different examples of churches under threat, others being taken down prematurely, and you can see the variety of places that are being lost in the meantime. One of the key linkages between all of these places is funding, and so that's why in our goals we've focused on that. One of the interesting things, if we look at the federal role in funding and helping to tip the balance between preservation or heritage rehabilitation and new construction, is the fact that the federal government isn't really a player, or isn't a player at all. And if you look at the kinds of funds available for income-producing properties in Edmonton, Winnipeg, or Regina and Peterborough, you can see that there is some support there from the municipalities and the provinces, but nothing from the federal government. And if you look just south of the border into Tom Cassidy's territory, you'll see that it's a much more balanced support from all three levels of government: state, municipal, and federal. And this is an example taken from Dallas, and very, very, very kind of a compelling case there. So then I guess what we want to do now is turn to Tom Cassidy at the National Trust for Historic Preservation south of the border. And again, he's the VP of Government Relations there, and they've just come off an exciting work to retain the historic tax credit in the face of real odds with the tax reform politics south of the border, where it was really genuinely threatened with being eliminated after having about 40 years of success there. So we want to learn from Tom and his colleagues about what we can do and emulate north of the border. So Tom, over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you. We launched this campaign beginning about 6 years ago, and the reason we did is because the federal historic tax credit is far and away advance the slide, please. We did this because the historic tax credit is far and away the most significant federal investment in preservation. And we have the numbers here, but I mean, I think the two ones that really stick with me are that more than 42,000 buildings in the United States are now in productive reuse because of this tax credit. But for the tax credit, few of those would be commercially usable buildings. It's created a lot of jobs. It's leveraged $131 billion in private capital. And it has also, importantly, returned more money to the federal treasury than every dollar of tax credit. Next slide, please. And we launched this campaign because there was this tsunami of pressure that was rising to change the tax code. And we did not know when that would happen, but we knew that it would at some point, and we needed to be prepared. So we developed a strategic plan oriented around effective advocacy. And we'll get into those elements in the rest of the presentation here. We knew that we had to mobilize a constituency much larger than was traditionally engaged in federal preservation advocacy. And we knew that we confronted the challenge that the historic tax credit, I mean, the good news is that it has been part of permanent law since 1981. It survived the last serious effort at reforming our tax code back in 1986, but many other tax incentives were in a every 2-year need for renewal and extension. So those communities, those constituencies had been in campaign mode for about 10 years, whereas the preservation community had not needed to engage. And we had to turn that around. Next slide. I think as I've thought about this campaign, I've tried to elicit, tried to determine what were the elements of success. And I think that at the top was a focus early on and a determined focus on one policy issue, which was to preserve this 20% federal tax credit and also to recommend improvements to it. The improvements were really designed to bring in more constituencies, notably small Main Street communities, by making a change to make smaller deals more effective. And part of the focus was to avoid the constant encouragement by others to broaden our focus to other tax credits like homeowners tax credits or another aspect of the federal tax credit that was used for old buildings, or engage in efforts that are very, very worthwhile to have, you know, transit-oriented tax credits. But we made the decision that the prize was the 20% federal historic tax credit, and that's all that we worked on. Next slide, please. Early on, we concluded that since this tax credit had not been a part of policy debate at the federal level in 30 years, then we needed to ground truth whether we were even in the game by measuring if it was supported or opposed by voters. So we commissioned a bipartisan polling firm to do an in-depth poll of more than 800 voters, supplemented by telephone polls to help us with our messages. And what we found is that it was supported by a margin of 61 to 28%. That gave us the confidence that we could go into any congressional office and be confident that our message had the opportunity to resonate. Next slide, please. We also developed some of the best advocacy documents that I've ever been able to use in my 30 years of advocacy. At the core of it was we had some spectacular economic research by Rutgers University on the impacts of the tax credit, and they developed an economic model that dealt with, based upon the value of the credit, how many jobs would be created, what was the leverage value. That was essential. It's actually now being paid for on an annual basis by the National Park Service and published under their imprimatur, but we launched that. We developed other reports on the tax credits in particular key states, and then we were able to develop using mapping software, develop maps of every state in the country and key congressional districts that would map and then list all of the tax credits on a separate piece of paper. Next slide. We engaged, we mobilized a constituency unlike anything that has been mobilized in preservation before in the United States. When we worked not only with the traditional preservation NGO community, but we also enlisted the business community, and that was essential to our success, absolutely essential. We also had sign-on letters in support of the tax credits and the legislation we had, that we had mayors groups, Main Street programs. In the fall of this past year, we had a national sign-on letter with more than 1,500 organizations and businesses. Nothing like that had been done in our field before. And we also had, 13,000 people took action via our website in the fall. And we had literally thousands and thousands of meetings with members of Congress, both here in DC and in their home districts or their ridings, if you will. Next slide. We also were able to use the media as an essential part of our campaign from the time we launched it. We had an enormous volume of stories placed around the country. We did a media handbook for our partners to use to great effect. And then in the fall, when the pressure to develop a tax bill became overwhelming, we really cranked up. We had nearly 300 media stories in the last 3 months of the campaign, with like 600 million media impressions. We use social media to a degree we never had before. And we also had this remarkable discovery of an archival video footage of President Reagan, very popular conservative down here even today, describing the benefits of this tax credit that he described as one of his initiatives. That message we made into a 2-minute YouTube-linked video, and it's been viewed by more than 500,000 times. So the result of all of this is on the next slide. And we saved the historic tax credit. So it was, came down to the wire, literally. It was one of the last things included in the Senate bill, and then we won. So you can do it too. Thank you. I'm done for now.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's Chris here, and hugely inspirational. And what has happened south of the border should be a model for us in terms of all the galvanizing support and bringing the necessary tools together to make it happen. So Tom's going to stay on the line, and he's going to be here for the question and answer period at the end. So thank you for now, Tom, but hope to hear more from you later. So right now I'll pass on, we'll come back to north of the border, to the Canadian context, and I'm going to pass on the baton to Natalie again to run us through our year of action.
Great, thank you, Chris. So Tom made it clear that mobilizing and being active as a sector is an important part of achieving and then retaining a tax credit for historic places. So we certainly have lots to learn from the US model, and certainly we've been talking about the US tax incentive as a model program for Canada for quite some time. So we're going to go through three elements of the year of action. First, we're going to talk about focusing the ask to government, making historic places matter politically, and then thirdly, influencing federal budgets and decision making. So these are really the three main thrusts of our strategy, and it's all about getting political will on side, getting us into campaign mode. So the first one, focusing the ask to government. Tom talked about focus as well. We laid out priorities. Chris ran you through those, really keeping it simple with just focusing on financial measures. We had those priorities endorsed by over 1,000 people between when we launched those in the fall. And then when the minister's report, the Environment Committee report was published, we quickly gathered the support for those priorities from 24 national, provincial, territorial organizations. So quickly getting in there and letting the minister and the Environment Committee know that of their really all very interesting recommendations, there are a handful that really respond to the pressing needs of the sector. So our goal is really to keep those priorities in mind and ultimately see them show up in Budget 2018 and Budget 2019. The next slide shows those priorities again. Again, it's all about financial measures from the federal government. Next slide. The second part of the strategy is to make historic places matter politically. And again, we saw some great examples from the US of how the National Trust was able to lead exactly that in the US. So we need to be careful that what we're asking for resonates with other important priorities for this government and for Canada, that it speaks to Indigenous heritage places, that we connect our ask to the environment and to the economy. Tom talked about mapping, so we have the opportunity with all of you on the line to identify places at risk in particular ridings and use them strategically to get attention. We need you to connect with MPs from all parties. So heritage is local, these issues are local. So it's really about getting everyone out there talking to as many elected officials as possible. Lining up those partners, again, as Tom talked about, mayors, leaders in the business community, we need to have as many voices behind this ask as we can possibly manage. And finally, getting media attention and lots of activity on social media. The third thrust is to ultimately influence the federal budget. So we need Liberal MPs to be telling the environment minister and the finance minister, look, all these people in my riding are so keen to have this incentive. It really is something that we need to act on. And then for the other parties, we need the Conservative and the NDP MPs also to be putting pressure on the government to react to these priorities. So as Gil mentioned, they're already lined up behind our goals. And then fourthly, the National Trust will work with the Finance Department to respond to their resistance to the tax incentive, and that's using great data from the CHIPIF results and also from the US tax credit model. We're also working directly with the Minister's Office and with Parks Canada staff. So quickly looking at the timeline for action, we have a number of opportunities. They're here on the screen. I'll run through them quickly one by one and talk about the opportunity and what you can do to take action, and then we'll segue into looking at the toolkit. So the first opportunity right now, between now and the run up to Heritage Week, which is starting February 19th, what you can do is organize a meeting. Your MPs are at home in their ridings during that week. So it's an opportunity to set up a meeting and make the ask, talk to them about the priorities, and then follow up. Again, opportunities to tweet, and so we'll show you some Heritage Week themed tweets that you can use, and they're part of the toolkit. And then you can email and write letters to MPs as well, wherever possible, plugging in a local example of an endangered place. The next opportunity will be responding to Federal Budget 2018. And we're expecting that late February, possibly the 26th, 27th of February. Note that we're not expecting to see everything that we're asking for in our priorities in this budget. That it's possible, and we'll certainly celebrate if we do. We do expect there will be some good news on the Heritage Places front in the budget. So we will be poised and ready to issue a statement that will go out to all of you in our e-newsletter and in social media. So we'll be sharing our position, and we encourage you to echo that position. So again, it's about staying positive and really recognizing that this is a year of action. We're not going to get every gain that we need in this upcoming budget. Another opportunity, the top 10 endangered places list that the National Trust leads here in Canada. Nominations period opening later this month and running to March 27th. So an opportunity here for all of us to be tweeting about endangered places and connecting those places to the potential to resolve the issue in the federal budget with incentives. So again, it's another opportunity to meet with MPs, to retweet our own publication of the list, and to tie them to local places that need financial incentives in your community. And we're also going to provide in the toolkit examples of op-eds that you can use, again, using the endangered places list as a hook. A fourth opportunity is the House of Commons debate on Bill C-323. So we know that the Environment Committee has already tabled a negative response to Bill C-323, but couched in very positive language. And then that similar kind of language also reflected in the Environment Committee report. But when those statements are made in the House of Commons, again, we will make a statement and share it broadly and encourage you to echo that through your own mechanisms. Again, this will also be an opportunity for a cascade of op-eds across the country, and we're happy to share examples with you. A fifth opportunity, the Environment Minister is required to respond to the Environment Committee's report, Preserving Canada's Heritage, within 120 days from its publication. So the clock is now ticking, and we're expecting that sometime, it could be any time now, but before the end of April, the minister will be issuing a formal response. And it might be a fulsome response where she identifies particular recommendations that the government will move forward on. It could be a very detailed or superficial response. We really don't know what to expect. And I think at this point, we'll pause in our strategy making. It's a milestone where we need to look at what that response is and set our strategy for the coming period accordingly. Ultimately, the long-range goal, I think, for us is the federal budget 2019. So again, this year of action toward that federal budget. And I might ask Gil Barrows to talk a bit about the political challenge and opportunity.
Thanks, Natalie. The political environment right now is that the 2018 budget is coming out in probably the last week in February. We expect that it'll be a modest budget. It's the 2019 budget that'll be the big spending budget, we assume, because 2019 is the election year. So a year from now, the 2019 budget comes out, and then in October 2019 is the election. So as Natalie said, there may be things in the Liberal budget in the next few weeks, but not the big prize. We'd be very doubtful if it's in there. That debate's still evolving, and we've got plenty of time to shape it. Again, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. We're looking at the 2019 budget, and just keep in mind that I'll quote an American, Tip O'Neill, senator, was quite well known. He said, "All politics is local." Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but there's a lot of truth in it. And so the work that the National Trust is doing here in Ottawa needs to be supplemented locally.
So Chris here, I'm just going to take over and talk about to try to make it real for you locally and hopefully encourage you to feel empowered to meet with your federal member of parliament. We've put together a toolkit and it's up on our website at that advocacy action section on our website, which you'll be able to follow from that link below. And it includes a number of different pieces, which I wanted to go through with you right now. So part of it is actually getting to know the issues. And I think we all have a good sense of the issues, but it's good when you get in the room, when you're talking with your elected official, to know, to have the confidence to speak on a wide range of these. So we brought together the essentials. I know that Tom was talking about focus. So these are the essentials here in terms of what you really need to feel up to speed on what's happening currently. And that includes the Environment Committee report, Minister McKenna's press release to that report, responding to that report, which is sort of high level, but also kind of indicates a certain level of interest there. Also the heritage sector's response to the NB report, which kind of highlights the heritage community areas and goals that they're particularly interested in, and pulling out some of the key recommendations that support those goals from that report. There's also an overview of heritage conservation in Canada. This is like extreme background, high-level background that Natalie and I gave at the Environment Committee meetings, and I think it gives a little bit of an overview of what are the challenges, what are the types of buildings or places that we're thinking about and what they're facing. And also, again, that Liberal election response from 2015. There's other additional materials if you want to go really deep into it, about Bill C-323 and other Parliamentary Budget Office's cost estimates around tax credits. So they're there if you want, and we're going to actually be adding to more of those for those of you who are really have a keen appetite. We're going to add more over time. So part 2, meeting with your MP. We've also put together some materials for that, and that includes really basic stuff about finding out their best contact information, finding out when they're going to be in their ridings, when's the likely time that they're going to be there. The parliamentary schedule is a little bit chopped up. People are going to be off for Easter and different points later in February. I think it's maybe it's next week when they're off. So it's good to know, just to get thinking about, oh, when can I ask for a meeting with them, is to have that parliamentary calendar in mind, because sometimes they're going to be more than likely in Ottawa if they're those green sections of that calendar. Also, we've created some letters for to send to MPs to request a meeting, but if they may not be available, it's always good to have them brought up to speed on what you're interested in and what the concerns are around these around the measures that you think that the federal government should bring into play. So we've tailored those for Liberal, Conservative, and NDP members, just because they have slightly different takes historically on those credits, and have slightly different kind of commitments to those things over time. There's going to be tips for meeting. There's a kind of a distilled tips for meeting with your MP ideas there, and Gil's going to dive into that in a more meaty way in a few moments. And there's also a presentation deck, and this is quite a substantial one, and we're going to be tweaking this too in terms of the note pages, and try to create a coherent, compact deck that would sort of lead MPs into what the current state of affairs is and what the federal government can do to help ameliorate the situation. So lots there to chew on, and I want to hand it over to Gil, who can talk about meeting with MPs more fully.
Thanks, Chris. We've been talking about MPs, and they should be our primary focus, but don't forget mayors, and they'll be happy to badger the federal government because it's not going to cost them anything. And they'll say, yeah, federal government, you should spend more money. And to be fair to them, they've been carrying the lion's share of the expenditures anyway, so it's fair that the federal government should. So don't forget your mayors, don't forget your local chamber of commerce. And I think that Tom emphasized having the business sector on side is really important. It gives an awful lot of credibility to your arguments. Don't forget senators. We used to, because they were a sleepy organization, but they've become more and more influential in the last 2 years simply because the Trudeau government has made them independent. He said to them, you will be independent senators. And at first they resented it, and now they're saying, okay, fine, we're independent, come and talk to us. So the Liberals need all the senators, including the independent senators group, which is incidentally now the largest group of senators in the Senate. They need those senators to vote for the legislation that the government is trying to pass. So there's some things here. Is this, could I just ask Chris, are my slides in the toolkit that people can look at?
Well, no. I mean, we should put them in there, Gil. We've sort of distilled some of the kind of the high level understandings into the toolkit. Yeah.
Okay. But basically, when you're meeting with your MP, you make a request, and the thing to remember is that a lot of people are nervous about meeting their MPs, which is a bit ironic because the MP wants to meet constituencies and he wants you to vote for them. So that's key to remember. And the other really key thing is once you've made the request, you've got the meeting, listen. Often people go in and talk, but they don't really listen to what the MP's questions are. And that's vital. You want a dialogue. And let's say, next slide. Time is really sensitive with the MPs. God love them, they work awfully hard. And when they're in the riding, they've got to go to the Rotary dinner at night, and they've got meetings all day with constituents. So respect their time, show up early, and keep in mind that you probably have a half-hour meeting. And I think we can offer to help anybody with setting up meetings or that kind of stuff. So I guess we have a hotline that you can call, and we'll certainly do that. Make sure you ask how long they have to meet, and then if you can localize your presentation, that's very, very important. And the big thing is to listen, and then the final thing is to make the ask. Ask them for something. Ask an MP that a Liberal MP that what can you do? Can you send a letter? Will you talk to the Minister of Environment? Will you raise a question in the House? The Conservative MPs, ask them, what can you do? Would you send a letter? Would you make a statement in the House of Commons? Would the Conservative caucus as an entirety make a statement, or a caucus letter or statement to the minister, the Liberal minister? And for the NDP, it's the same thing. And I must say, the same thing for if you're meeting with a senator or a mayor, same thing. What can you do? Now, the important thing is, to make the ask at the end of the meeting. And if the MP says, gee, I'm not really comfortable, I need more information, that's great. Just say, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll get back to you. And that's how you open the dialogue. And then follow-up is really important. When an MP or a senator or whoever says, I'm going to do such and such, make sure you say to them, okay, when can we get back to you to see how it's come out? Okay, next slide.
All right, so going back to communications, as mentioned earlier, communications will play an integral role in this campaign. So our plan and strategy will include many tactics such as using social media, namely Twitter, engaging traditional media, and writing op-eds. We'll now go over some tools that we'll be providing you with. So we're focusing our efforts on Twitter, one of the reasons being that we're already seeing engagement on this platform. So we want to harness and optimize the excitement that's already there. So to help you harness this platform, we've provided you with hashtags and Twitter users to use and mention in your tweets. Using these hashtags will increase your reach, and mentioning the right accounts, in this case, Minister McKenna and Minister Morneau, will make sure the right people are seeing your tweets. So first of all, are you following us on Twitter? If not, our handle is @NationalTrustCA. So we encourage you to share our social media content. So look for tweets from our account during Heritage Week. On screen is a mock-up of a tweet that we plan to send out. Heritage Day, as discussed, is an opportunity to make the case for incentives. This year's theme is Heritage Stands the Test of Time, and we'll be linking the theme to the need for financial incentives. Here's another mock-up. Again, feel free to use our language, or you can create your own. As mentioned before, our Top 10 Endangered Places campaign is a great opportunity to make the case for financial incentives for historic buildings. So, for example, here we featured the Black Horse Pub in Peterborough, which was on our list last year. Key messages. So we've created a list of key messages that we'll be using, and we'll provide them to you soon in our online toolkit. So these will help drive the message home and show a united front. Finally, op-eds are very powerful. They're opinion pieces that you can submit to a newspaper. So here on screen, we have an example. Natalie Bull wrote an op-ed in the Hamilton Spectator and used Gore Park in Hamilton as an example to enforce the need for tax credits for historic places. So writing in a local paper using a local example can be a powerful exercise to make your point. So we've gone over communications quite quickly, but please tweet at us should you have any questions about communications.
So, Chris here, we're going to be having a continuation of this kind of bi-weekly time slot, which is going to be going forward too. So our next meeting will be on February 20th. And this is just a way to meet by teleconference to discuss strategy, to discuss opportunities that are opening up in terms of making the case for these incentives at the federal level, these measures at the federal level, and also talk about what opportunities are available there. So if you want to be engaged, please join us 2 weeks from today for our next meeting, and we can all help each other grow our presence. So here's my contact information and Natalie's. If you have any questions around your desire to bring together MP meetings or around things you'd like to see in the toolkits or changes there, please connect with us and we can help make that happen as well. So I want to open up there's just a link at the top again to our toolkit for different materials that we've created for you. And I wanted to open it up now for questions from the floor to see if any of you in the discussion forum are able to have questions about what we can talk about now.
So, well, I think, Chris, while you're absorbing the question we have here, I'll just say a word. It's Natalie here about advocacy, this kind of political activity and registered charities. So organizations on the line might be wondering about that. And basically, raising awareness, education, meeting with MPs to talk to them about the Environment Committee report and what's needed in the heritage sector. That's not actually considered political activity, but political activity is very carefully defined by the Canada Revenue Agency, and it's restricted to 10% of a charitable organization's resources. So your funding and your staff time needs to be less than 10%. Political action is explicitly communicating a call to political action, which is what the National Trust is doing here today. So this falls within our 10% limit on political activity. Communicating to the public, media campaigns, those kinds of things are political activity, but charities are permitted to do up to 10%. And few of us ever hit that limit. Certainly the National Trust is far from being at the 10% limit. So Chris, a question here for you.
Yeah, somebody has asked whether these tax credits at the federal level would benefit privately or municipally owned buildings designated under a particular provincial act. That's an interesting question because it comes up in the report from the Environment Committee, because the bill C-323, which was focused on tax credits, specifically mentioned the fact that buildings needed to be listed on the Canadian Register of Historic Places in order to be eligible for those tax credits. The answer to this question would be yes, because eventually those municipal and provincially designated buildings will be rolled up into the Canadian Register of Historic Places. One of the things that's mentioned in the Environment Committee report is the need to fund the Canadian Register of Historic Places, because there's actually a backlog of historic places that have yet to be included on that list. There's about 13 or 14,000 buildings in that, or properties on that list right now. The full number, when it's fully populated, is something more like 22,000. So there's a whole number of them that need to be included, and would be there.
It's Gil here. There's a question that's come up. Are electronic signatures acceptable when reaching out to MPs and senators? Absolutely. In fact, there are fewer and fewer letters that are coming into MPs and senators and all politicians' offices, and you can attach an electronic signature if you want, or you can just send an email. So absolutely, yes.
Chris here. I wanted to throw it out to Tom to see if he had some insights from the way we could. Tom, do you have any insights that you could suggest for us in terms of focusing our material? I guess you've seen us rehearsing some of it, but I think what I might hear you say is that we need to make sure we have the strong arguments and strong kind of background material that can help us make those economic arguments, those kind of local impact arguments. Those sounded like they were key from your side.
They're fundamental. We had and all this material is on the National Trust website at savingplaces.org, and I would encourage you to take a look at those and adapt them freely to your own situation. I've thought a lot about these maps that we had, and those maps we were able to get the data on the buildings that had used the tax credit. What you might consider would be to create maps that would depict those buildings that might benefit from the tax credit that you are interested in, or the districts, so that you can make it somehow more tangible. We had the benefit of having this tax credit been around for a while, so we had very solid economic data. And I guess I would just encourage you to think hard on what the best analysis that you have that describes the economic impact of historic preservation in your communities, particularly as it relates to the impact that a revitalized building might have on the adjoining neighborhood. We did Donathan Ripkema did a study on the catalytic impact that one building or several buildings can have on an otherwise depressed neighborhood, and it was enormously compelling.
Tom, another thing I was going to ask you is, Chris here, you actually met MPs and you would take them to sites of places where the tax credit had been used, and that must be a powerful way to do it. Do you think it would work to bring people to sites that might benefit from a tax credit? Would that be another way to make it, bring it home rather than this kind of impact?
No, I think, absolutely. What we have in our field is the power of place. And, your MPs are members of their communities, and they know these places. And I would just find people, your constituents. And again, I would go back to, it was just so impactful having a person in business who could say, I've got 85 people working in your district today on a historic rehabilitation project. And that made it more real than anything that I could ever say. But yes, get Get your MPs out. They want to be in the real world. I mean, they might like being up on Parliament Hill. Who wouldn't? But what they really like is to be out there in the world, and people want to learn, and you can help them understand what's of significance. And no better time, no better place to do it than on a field trip.
Great, thanks, Tom. And I think here in Canada, maybe the most powerful use of those field trips is to take your MP to a place that's really desperately in need of these kinds of incentives. And so I think in one of the steps we outlined, an opportunity is around our nominations for the endangered places list in Canada. So a great way for everyone to get involved in identifying all those endangered places out there that your MPs need to be aware of, and to incentivize them to take action. We have another question here about the priorities. So we've mentioned a couple of times the importance of staying focused. So there were 17 recommendations in the Environment Committee report, and the question is, if an MP asks you, what are the top 3 priorities? So we have grouped the priorities in 2 areas. One is financial measures that would encourage private sector investment in the revitalization of historic places. The second one, measures that would help fund the efforts of Indigenous peoples, charities, and not-for-profits. And so within those 2 types of priorities, that could include grants and contributions, tax-based incentives, or policies that encourage investment. If you look specifically at the Environment Committee report, we've identified 6 of those 17 that would really fall under those 2 thrusts. And they are Recommendation 11, which is about a tax credit, Recommendation 10, which is funding for the National Cost Share Program, Recommendations 15 and 17, which are about Indigenous-led heritage initiatives and funding. Recommendation 14, which would be an initiative modeled after Main Street, but again, it's all about funding. And then Recommendation 8 would be a measure for federal agencies to give priorities to using historic places, something that would, we believe, change the landscape for heritage property owners. And a related recommendation is Recommendation 9, which is about strengthening the tools that would be essential to administer a tax incentive. So that's all laid out in the letter that we wrote to the Minister of the Environment, responding to the Environment Committee study. And that's in the toolkit. It's one of the documents available for everyone. But again, I think we can keep it simple and just say that our goal is about financial measures for historic places. Any of those recommendations that would flow funding and incentivize investment on the part of Canadians in historic places.
Chrissy, there's another question. A person is asking, aside from slides provided by this presentation, can you link us to the best summary you have online to provide to a municipal heritage committee that sums up the whole last few months nicely, or should I email to find out more about this? I think have a look at the presentation deck for MPs. I guess that's more geared towards the federal level. I think we can do we could create another document that may more neatly distill the kind of the momentum around the discussion over the last year to help bring people up to speed. I can see your point in terms of wanting to bring sort of the local heritage committees into up to speed really quickly. So I think that's an excellent point about creating a slightly different kind of document, PowerPoint, that would be geared towards that constituency. So we'll work on that one.
Yeah, and we can add that to the toolkit. I think that's a great point, that having messaging that is directed at other people we want to take action. So to engage other national and provincial organizations, construction associations, to present to mayors would be a really useful tool. So we'll get on that. Great. Well, maybe we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much for everyone who's participated. The URL is there on the screen for the toolkit. And I think the next slide is a general contact information for the National Trust. So again, just thanks very much to everyone. We know that many of you took action around Bill C-323 and wrote letters and had meetings with your MPs, and we're conscious of the risk of advocate fatigue. So in this presentation, and in the toolkit, we've outlined those opportunities for action. We're trying to make it easy for everyone to take action. So please keep the faith. Let's stay focused. We want you to be part of it. We won't achieve financial measures for historic places without the action of all heritage advocates and all of your friends and relatives. So watch our newsletters, check out the URL, and join those teleconferences coming up in 2 weeks, starting in 2 weeks.
And thank you very much to Tom Cassie for joining us from Washington, our special guest. It's a hugely inspiring and exciting situation down in the US, and we want to learn from what you've achieved down there, Tom, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule for this today.
And thanks to Gil Barrows, who's been our faithful government relations consultant, helping us through the excitement of the last couple of years in heritage in Canada. Thanks all.
Thanks.